And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is the top 20 cards from Modern Horizons 2 for Commander. Overall, I think Modern Horizons 2 was a pretty fantastic set for EDH players. Just like with Strixhaven, I had no problem getting to 20 cards to put on this list. In fact, I even have some honorable mentions, and in the honorable mentions, I like to include the ones that I think are definitely going to see play but are a little more niche. So for example, Echoing Return, 1 mana sorcery, return target creature card and all other cards with the same name as that card from your graveyard to your hand. Only reason I'm mentioning this card is because it is an auto include if you're playing one of those decks, right? Relentless Rats or Shadowborn Apostles. Those are the decks where this is an absolute auto include, right? If you're one of the people playing those decks, you're going to put this card in there because it's going to return all of them to your hand. Another honorable mention, and for the same reason, Tavern Scoundrel, 1 in red human rogue, 1/3. Whenever you win a coin flip, create 2 treasure tokens. That's pretty fantastic in any deck where you are already flipping coins, right? Also, though, has pay 1 and tap, sacrifice another permanent, flip a coin. So the interesting thing here is you could technically put this in almost any deck because you can sacrifice a permanent, flip a coin. If you win the flip, you create 2 treasure tokens. You can then continue the process where you sacrifice one of the treasure tokens to flip another coin and so on and so forth. I think ultimately, though, you're only going to put this in decks where you're flipping coins, though. I had to give it a mention, though, because if you're in a coin flipping deck, this is an absolute auto include there. So getting to the list, coming in at number 20, Blessed Respite. 1 in a green, instant. Target player shuffles their graveyard into their library. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. I really like this card. I know it probably doesn't look like much, but I love versatile cards in Commander because, there's always going to be the situation that you're not prepared for. And this is doing so much that I think it could probably go in just about any deck because you're never going to have a situation where it's not going to be usable. I really like cards like that. This is target player shuffles their graveyard into your library. So first of all, you can use it on yourself, right? So if I'm getting milled, I can use it on myself and there's no way I can get milled out. So it saves you in that situation. It helps in any situation where you want stuff to be shuffled into your library. So for example, if you have a deck where you're searching for creatures and you want those creatures in your library rather than your graveyard, obviously you can use it on your opponents too, though. It's a fantastic graveyard hate card. This is instant speed, right? My opponent's about to reanimate that giant creature. I just quickly shuffle it back into their library, problem solved. And then on top of all of that, it's also a fog. This is just going to sit in your hand, sort of maybe like a counter spell where I'm just waiting for the perfect moment to use it. And oh, look at that. My opponent just cast a Craterhoof Behemoth and is about to kill me. And now I can use it as a fog. And as an added bonus, I'll just shuffle some cards back into my library or I'll hate on someone else's graveyard. I really, really like this card and I'm going to try and find room for it in as many of my decks as I can. Coming in at number 19, Search the Premises. 3 in a white enchantment. And of course, we got to have some of those Let's Help White draw cards in every set. So this is whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, investigate. And as we all know, people never attack in casual Commander games, so this is a terrible card, am I right? No, of course people are always attacking in casual games. And I know people are probably going to look at this and think, okay, first of all, you're not drawing a card, you have to pay for the clue. Sure, but if this was just an enchantment that said, pay 2 colorless mana, draw a card, you absolutely would be putting it in all your mono white decks and probably a lot of other decks as well, right? Now, of course, that's not always the case. Maybe your opponents just won't attack you. That's pretty good too, right? Isn't it good if our opponents aren't attacking us? I think this is win-win here. This is either our opponents don't attack us at all or we get clue tokens that we can draw cards with. I think it definitely is going to see play in the format. Coming in at number 18, Profane Tudor. And I wasn't sure where to put this. I was going to put it way towards the top. And then the more I thought about it, the more it sort of crept down the list. This is again, another spell that you can't cast. It doesn't have a casting cost. Obviously you can cascade and do it. There are tricks you can do here, but it's suspend 2, 1 in a black. And again, this is like the fixed version of Demonic Tutor. I think the idea behind these cards is let's take an old card that's way too powerful and make a fixed version of it. You just search your library for a card and put it into your hand, then shuffle, right? So it's just a Demonic Tutor that you have to suspend. Now, I know people are going to play this. It's on the list because it's absolutely going to see play in the format. However, I'm just thinking, is it really that good, right? Usually when you want to tutor, you want to do it right away. Obviously, if you suspend this and it resolves and you get to go get anything out of your library, that's also good. But there's so many really good tutors in black already that, I don't know, if you're in a deck where you want to be tutoring lots, you're not going to take any tutors out for this, that's for sure. You're probably not even going to add this. I mean, maybe not. Also, another issue here is I know people are going to say, all right, well, it's going to be cheaper. It's going to be cheaper than a lot of those other tutors, so I can play it and I can't afford those other ones. Sure, but it's in Modern. This is a Modern legal card, so I think a lot of Modern players are going to play it, so I don't think it's going to be that cheap. I think that's another issue. Coming in at number 17, Chef's Kiss. 1 red instant. Gain control of target spell that targets only a single permanent or player. Copy it, then reselect the targets at random for the spell and the copy. The new targets can't be you or permanents you control. So a lot to sort of dissect here. Basically what's happening, your opponent casts a spell, and I always like to use an actual example here to help sort of explain how this works. Your opponent casts a Swords to Plowshares, right? You're going to gain control of that spell. And the gain control part, you know, I was thinking, why did they say gain control instead of just redirect? The reason they say gain control is because it can't be a permanent you control. So if someone casts a spell that says, for example, Cyclonic Rift, right? You bounce a permanent that an opponent controls, that has to be your opponent. So that's why you're gaining control of it so that the wording works there, right? So back to the example of Swords to Plowshares, we're going to copy it and then reselect the targets for both at random. So basically what happens is we get 2 Swords to Plowshares and we're going to exile 2 of our opponent's creatures at random. That's pretty darn good. Obviously, it would be ideal if we could choose, but then this card would be completely busted. I think just we exile 2 of our opponent's creatures at random is pretty darn good. And then don't forget, on top of that, you're probably redirecting it from your own creature, right? This is probably my opponent's going to swords my creature, and now instead my creature gets saved and then exiles 2 of my opponent's creatures, right? It can't target you. The new targets can't be you or a permanent you control. So all of your stuff is safe. Yeah, you can just do this, you know, just for random, you know, let's see what happens. But typically I think you're going to want to use this spell to save something of yours. And then the added bonus of let's remove some of my opponent's stuff. Definitely going to see play in the format. Coming in at number 16, Priest of Fell Rites. White and a black, human warlock 2/2. Tap, pay 3 life, sacrifice Priest of Fell Rites, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So it is a creature that is a reanimate. That's really fantastic. The pay 3 life, you know, big deal. We would much rather see that on a commander card than have to pay an actual mana activation cost. And then to make things even better, it has Unearth, 3 white and a black, right? So of course you pay that 5 mana, return it to play, and it has haste, so you can immediately use that ability. So you're going to use your Priest of Fell Rites, return something to play, it goes to the graveyard, and then later in the game, you can do it again. Any Aristocrats deck, which usually are black and white, this is going to be sacrificing itself, so you already have that added bonus. So it's already fitting the theme of what you're doing. You return some other creature that you've sacrificed, then you get to do it again. I always love when abilities like this are stapled on creatures because you can abuse them. Really versatile card. I think it's going to see lots of play in the format. Coming in at number 15, Murktide Regent. 5 blue for a 3/3. That's awful, except it has Delve, and we all know that is a really powerful ability. It can cost up to 5 less, right? So just blue for a 3/3 flyer is pretty good. However, also, Murktide Regent enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each instant and sorcery card exiled with it. Wowee. Now, you don't have to do all instants and sorceries. Let's say you only had 3. Okay, let's say you exiled 5 cards. 3 of them are instants and sorceries. Now we're going to put 3 counters on our creature. So we just got a 6/6 flyer for 2 mana. That's pretty incredible. And then on top of that, whenever an instant or sorcery card leaves your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Murktide Regent. Wow. I think this card's going to see tons of play in Modern and Legacy. I suspect it's going to be really expensive for that reason because, you know, everyone loves Delve in Modern, of course, and in Legacy. Having possibly an 8/8 flyer for 2 mana is insane, of course. Even in Commander, that's damn good. In Modern and Legacy, it's just ridiculous. So right away, you're thinking, okay, instant and sorcery deck, obviously. In any deck where you're just casting instants and sorceries normally, you're doing a lot of spell slinging, even in just a mono blue deck where you're doing lots of spell slinging, this can just be a cheap, you know, I get this out later in the game just to close things out. Also, whenever an instant sorcery card leaves your graveyard, you put a counter on it. So maybe in a Savin deck where you're doing lots of that as well, you can add counters to it. Any graveyard deck where you're just milling yourself lots, maybe you're in a blue-black graveyard deck, you're milling yourself lots, just putting lots of stuff in your graveyard, right? Again, it doesn't have to be instants and sorceries. That's just an added bonus. I think this is definitely going to see lots of play in the format because it just goes in so many decks and can be a finisher for you. Coming in at number 14, Obsidian Charma, 3 red dragon. It's a 4/4 with flying, and this spell costs 1 less to cast for each land your opponents control that could produce colorless mana. So first off, this is lands your opponents control. So you got 3 opponents. If they each only have 1 land that produces colorless mana, which is very likely, this guy's only going to cost 2 red mana. Just a red and a red for a 4/4 flyer. And then when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. And like I say all the time, you absolutely have to have land hate, particularly non-basic land hate, right? We don't really need to kill basic lands in Commander. We absolutely have to be able to kill non-basic lands. So this is just a card that could go in any deck. You know, it's a dragon, so you could put it in a dragon deck for sure. I think almost always this guy's going to cost 2 mana. This is 2 mana. I get a 4/4 flyer, and I get to kill one of my opponent's non-basic lands. And again, stapled on a creature. Anytime you have an ability like this stapled on a creature is fantastic. You can blink it, you can recur it, whatever. Coming in at number 13, necrogoif. And we don't see a lot of goifs in Commander, but this is one I think is definitely going to see some play. 3 black, lurgoif, and it is a star 4. So its power is going to be equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards, and then it has a toughness of 4. So right away, creature cards in all graveyards, that can be, even if you're not doing any milling of any sort at all, or any discard or anything like that, just regular old how many creatures end up in the graveyards, that's going to get huge fairly quickly. But also at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player discards a card. So now we're getting into, okay, this card fits really well in a discard deck. You have to discard 2, okay? However, you're going to play it in a deck where you also want to discard, right? Maybe you're playing a milling deck. This actually works in a milling deck because, for starters, he's going to be enormous. Secondly, discard works with mill, right? Discard and mill sort of work tandemly. And then really for me, what puts this card over the top is the fact that it has madness. 1 black, and 3 mana to get this guy in play is fantastic. So again, if you're playing in a discard themed deck, you cheat this guy into play for 3 mana. That's amazing. You're going to have a huge creature for 3 mana on top of the fact that you're making everyone discard on their upkeeps. I think this goes in a lot of Commander decks. Coming in at number 12, Out of Time. 1 white enchantment. When Out of Time enters the battlefield, untap all creatures, then phase them out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Put a time counter on Out of Time for each creature phased out this way, and it has vanishing, right? And for anyone who doesn't know what vanishing does, at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter, and when the last one's removed, you sacrifice it. So this card is essentially, at its core, a white board wipe, which, you know, I mean, there's tons of fantastic white board wipes already. However, there's a lot of unique things about this. First of all, it's 3 mana. It gets better the more creatures you hit. Just like with any board wipe, it gets better the more creatures you hit, right? Because if there's, say, 8 creatures in play, you're going to put a time counter on Out of Time for each creature that got phased out. So this gets 8 time counters on it. I mean, the game's probably going to be over before this thing leaves the table, right? Obviously, you can throw this in your Atraxa deck and just keep proliferating so that it never leaves the table. You know, obviously your opponents can just remove it, right? And if they do, all the creatures come back in. There's some shenanigans you can get into here, but what I really like about this card in Commander, again, specifically, just like I talked about with Oubliette, the reason why Oubliette is significant in a Commander game is because you can phase out your opponent's Commander and then they don't have access to it. Unlike with, say, an Oblivion Ring, you Oblivion Ring your opponent's Commander, it goes to exile and they can choose to put it in the command zone. Doesn't work with phasing, so it doesn't work with Out of Time either. You can phase out all your opponents' commanders with this. If your opponents all have their commanders in play and you cast this, you just phased out all their commanders and they have no access to them, right? They cannot choose to put it in the command zone. There's nothing they can do except get your Out of Time off the table. So that's why I think this card is really, really significant in the format. It's going to see a lot of play. Coming in at number 11, Unmarked Grave, 1 and a black sorcery. Search your library for a non-legendary card, put that card in your graveyard, then shuffle. That's it. Very simple. You know, Orc Lore Mage was really high on my Strixhaven list for the same reason. Just being able to put things directly in your graveyard is really, really powerful for a lot of different reasons. This is non-legendary, so it's not quite as good as Entomb. The obvious comparison here is Entomb. You can't choose a legendary creature. It's not an instant speed like Entomb is. It's still fantastic. There's just so many decks this goes in. It goes in so many decks that you want to be putting stuff in your graveyard, which there are many. And now we're into the top 10, and coming in at number 10 is Ornithopter of Paradise. 2 mana, artifact creature, Thopter, flying 0/2, and it just has tap, add 1 mana of any color. That's it. This is just a mana rock. It's a mana rock creature, right? So it's essentially a Birds of Paradise for 2 mana instead of 1, but it's colorless. It goes in any deck. That's why I have it so high on this list. I always put colorless cards a little bit higher than I would anything else because it's an option for anything. 2 mana rocks are really, really good in Commander. Really, the format is moving away from the 3 mana rocks, so I think this is going to go in a ton of decks. It is a creature, so it's going to have summoning sickness, right? You can't use it right away, but really, I think, you know, most of the time when you play an Arcane Signet on turn 2, typically you're not tapping it right away. I mean, if you just think about a card like Darksteel Ingot, for example, a card that used to get played a lot, maybe still does quite a bit, I don't know. But if I am comparing these two, turn 2, I'm going to play my Ornithopter of Paradise. It's not going to be able to be tapped, but that's okay. I'm going to untap on turn 3, play a land. Now I have 4 mana. Darksteel Ingot, I can't play on turn 2, obviously. I'm going to wait till turn 3, then I'm going to play it. It comes into play untapped, but I only have 1 mana, right? So I'm turn 3, 1 mana, as opposed to, in the other scenario, turn 3, 4 mana. I think that's way, way better. It is very susceptible to removal, obviously. Artifact creature, so it dies to artifact removal and creature removal. No one is ever going to target this with the removal, though. The only issue here is the board wipe removal, right? That's the only way this is going to get off the table. I think you definitely could put it in a lot of decks that need a little bit of help, right? It's add 1 mana of any color. On top of the fact that it's great in any deck that wants artifact creatures, right? Like an Alabu deck or maybe an Alila deck or something like that. Coming in at number 9, and this is a spicy one, Void Mirror, and I wasn't sure where to put this on the list. It's definitely powerful and it definitely does a lot. It's just a straight up 2 mana artifact. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. So this is big. This is really big. And again, it's going to make waves in Modern, I imagine, like crazy. If you're in a deck that is, I don't know, you're in a Bant deck, you want to cast your Arcane Signet, you just pay green and blue mana and you should be fine, right? So it's not necessarily going to counter all artifacts. It is going to counter anything free. That's, for me, what I really like about it. I really like that this counters free stuff. If no mana was spent to cast it, then no colored mana obviously was spent to cast it, so it's going to get countered. So all the free counter spells, right, your Fierce Guardianships, your Force of Wills, those aren't going to work. Those are basically going to get shut off. Anything else like Cascade, where you're cheating things into play by casting them for free, this completely shuts off a Svella deck, I guess. If that's a big concern of yours, here's an answer for it, right? Because that's casting stuff for free. There's lots of decks that are going to be casting stuff for free. Lots of spells that do it. This shuts off a lot of stuff. It even shuts off pretty much a colorless deck entirely. There's lots of colorless hate in this set for whatever reason. So it sucks for all the people out there that have a Hope of Gearper deck or a Ulamog deck, because this is just going to shut off your entire deck, which kind of sucks. I've even heard people calling for this to get banned in Commander for that reason, just because it completely shuts off anyone who's playing a colorless deck. So I don't know. I mean, I'm putting it pretty high on this list because it definitely is a powerful card that does a lot and is for sure going to see play in the format. Even in CEDH, you know, I don't make these lists for CEDH. I make them for casual Commander, but this definitely can see play in CEDH. Coming in at number 8, Persist, and this one's pretty simple. 1 and a black sorcery. Return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. That's it. This is just another recursion or reanimate spell. 2 mana. Again, it has to be non-legendary, which makes it a little limiting. You're putting a -1/-1 counter on it, which I think probably you don't care most of the time. But this is just a cheap, easy recursion spell that can go in so many decks. I mean, so many decks. I like to put cards on this list that I think are just going to see tons of play just because they're going to go in so many different decks. There's very little reason not to put this in your deck because there's always going to be a reason for you to use it, right? Coming in at number 7, Suspend. 1 mana instant. Exile target creature and put 2 time counters on it. If it doesn't have Suspend, it gains Suspend. I really like this card. This is another one that I'm going to try to fit in as many decks as I can. And the reason is because of the versatility, right? Obviously, you use this on your opponent's creature, exile target creature and put 2 time counters on it. Okay, this can break up a combo. Again, it's probably a card that's going to see lots of play in CEDH for that reason, because you can break up a combo with it. Your opponent gets their creature back. They got to wait 2 turns, but they get it back. It's very comparable to Delay, and I think Delay also gets used in CEDH quite a bit for that reason, because it just breaks up a combo. Your opponent gets their spell later on, but by then, you know, the combo's already broken up, so it doesn't matter. It can just save your life a lot of times. Your opponent has a Blightsteel Colossus, they're about to swing with it. Exile it, save your own life for at least a couple of turns, right? Just can really fix a lot of things in a pinch for only 1 mana, which I really like, but can also be used on your own creatures. That's the part that I really like about this. This can be, I have a creature in play, let's say it's just an Eternal Witness. Once I play my Eternal Witness, it's just sitting there, it's not doing much for me. I can suspend it, it comes back to play in 2 turns, and then I get to reuse it again, right? Or I save my commander from a board wipe. And if you think about it, you know, your opponent's gonna board wipe on their turn. You cast this in response, exile your commander, then at the beginning of your turn, you're immediately going to remove a time counter from this, and then you only got to wait 1 more turn, right? So it really isn't that long before you get your commander back. I just really, really love the versatility of this spell, and a 1 mana instant, I mean, really good. Coming in at number 6, Academy Manufactor, and I'm sure there's been a lot of buzz about this card. 3 mana artifact, creature, assembly worker, 1/3, and again, because it's a colorless card, it can go in any deck, which really pushes it up the list for me. If you would create a clue, food, or treasure token, instead create 1 of each. That's a really powerful ability. So right away, any deck where you're doing any of these things, this is an auto include, right? If I'm in a deck where I'm creating treasure tokens, let's say my Magda deck, every time I create a treasure token, I'm also getting a clue and a food token. That's huge, right? That's really huge. I get all 3. If I'm in a Lonis deck where I'm creating clue tokens, every time I create a clue token, I get a food and a treasure. That's amazing. If I'm in a Gaiome deck and I'm creating food tokens, I'm also going to get a clue and a treasure token every time I create a food token. That's amazing. This goes in so many decks. Again, any deck that is creating clue tokens or food tokens or treasure tokens on a regular basis is going to want this card. And you might just want to throw this in some other decks. You know, even I just cast my Dockside Extortionist, I get, I don't know, 5 treasure tokens, let's say. Now I'm going to get 5 treasure tokens and 5 clue tokens and 5 food tokens. That's tons of value. This card is going to see a ton of play in the format, I think. Coming in at number 5, the new sword of the series, Sword of Hearth and Home. It has equip 2, and equipped creature gets +2/+2, and has protection from green and from white. So already that's pretty good. I really like the ability to, like, some of these abilities that these swords have fit way better in Commander than others. When a crypt creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then search your library for a basic land card. Put both cards onto the battlefield under your control, then shuffle. This sword just goes in so many decks. Any deck where you want to be blinking, right? So right away, you're blinking your creatures. I just made a Trata deck for my patron, and I told him, hey, throw this in there because it had just been spoiled. It goes in a Trata deck because you can attack with your commander, both triggers will go on the stack, and you just blink your commander so it doesn't get shuffled into your library. It can also get your stuff back. This is target creature you own. So someone steals a creature of yours, you blink that creature, it comes back into play under your control. You get it back, which is fantastic. And then heck, on top of all that, we're also ramping, right? So in any deck that needs help ramping, this is a fantastic option. It's basically Sword of the Animus, right? It's similar to Sword of the Animus, which gets played in the format like crazy. This is similar, where it's going to go get a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield. Untapped, by the way, right? Sword of the Animus gets tapped lands. This is going to get you a basic land card untapped and put it into play. It goes in a lot of decks. I mean, really, you could put this in almost any deck. I don't know if you're gonna. I'm just saying it fits in a lot of decks. Coming in at number 4, and this is another buzzworthy one, Esper, Sentinel. You know, I don't really get onto the other, social networking platforms and talk and get into the conversations and see what everyone is talking about. But people do comment on my videos. What do you think about this new card? What do you think about that new card? This is one of the cards that I've had people say, hey, what do you think about Esper Sentinel? 1 mana artifact, creature, human soldier, 1/1. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. So what do I think about it? Okay, so obviously I have it really high on this list because it's going to see a ton of play. It's going to see a ton of play in a lot of formats. It's already like a $30 card or something like that. It gets played in Legacy a lot, I would imagine, because this is, I can play it turn 1 in a Legacy game, and there's lots of people throwing non-creature spells around, and every time they do so, they're going to have to pay 1, which they probably won't because they just cast that Force of Will for free because they were tapped out. So you're going to get to draw a card. I think it's great in Legacy. It's great in Modern too. Okay, but we're talking about Commander. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless they pay X. So typically Esper Sentinel's power is just going to be 1, right? So if its power is 1, again, let's play through this scenario. Your opponent casts their first non-creature spell on their turn. So it's your opponent's turn. They want to cast their Arcane Signet. That's a non-creature spell. So just like with Ristic Study, they're going to have to pay 1, or else you get to draw, so they can just pay the 1 and then you don't get anything. So I'm sort of going down the maybe this isn't as good as you think road here. I mean, I have it really high. It's number 4 on the list. So obviously I think it is really good and it's going to see lots of play. However, once we get past the scenario of I've paid for the first one, now I don't have to pay at all. It's not like Ristic Study where I have to pay every time. This is the first non-creature spell that your opponent casts. They pay the 1, and then now they can just go nuts. Now they can cast non-creature spells all day long, and they don't have to worry about paying, right? So not nearly as good as Ristic Study in that regard. And again, artifact creature, very, very susceptible to removal. Dies to creature removal, dies to artifact removal. So there's that as well. However, we can also beef up the power here. I think this is an absolute fantastic include in a Boros Aura and equipment deck, right? Any Boros or an equipment deck is probably going to be beefing up your creature's power a lot. So for example, Sunforger, which is an auto include in any Boros equipment deck, you put that on this guy and now he's a 5/1. So now whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays 5? Yeah, there's no way they're doing that, right? Very comparable to Mystic Remora, right? Mystic Remora is 4 mana for a non-creature spell, and nobody ever pays that. I think I've maybe seen someone pay for Mystic Remora once every time I've seen it in play. So you know, it can be way, way better that way. Paying the 1, that's not difficult, right? As we all know from Ristic Study, which people should be paying for and don't pay for nearly enough, you really can pay the 1 very easily. And once you get past that first non-creature spell, then you're free, right, for the rest of the turn. It definitely is going to see play, right? I have it high on this list because a lot of people are going to play it. I think maybe it's not as good as people think. It's a lot better in certain decks. In certain decks where you can beef up that power. Coming in at number 3. And now again, we're getting to the cards that I think are just, I'm going to find room because why not put it in there, right? Dothi Voidwalker is a why not put it in your deck? You're just going to put it in there no matter what, as long as you can find room. Black, Dothi Rogue, and of course, I talk about Tempest block all the time. It was the first block that I played with, and of course, Dothi, Shadow Creatures, very nostalgic for me, so that's great. This whole set is sort of a nostalgia, like let's bring back these old mechanics sort of set, which is interesting. So it's a 3/2 with Shadow. Already, that's not bad. Shadow is essentially unblockable, even though I have been advocating for people to play more Shadow Creatures. So if everyone starts putting Shadow Creatures in their decks, these aren't going to be unblockable anymore. It can only be blocked or block a creature that has Shadow. So it can't really block either. But 3/2 unblockable creatures, pretty darn good. However, the really important stuff here is if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere instead exile it with a void counter on it. That is incredibly powerful. And again, this set has a ton of graveyard hate as well. A ton of colorless hate and a ton of graveyard hate. So many graveyard hate cards. So again, that must be a thing in Modern. Probably is in Modern. Usually there's always some really powerful graveyard decks. Maybe in Legacy as well, I don't know. But the important thing here is if a card, there's a lot of important things. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard, so only your opponents, not you. Just like I said with Author of Shadows, I really love that card because it doesn't hurt you. So even if you're playing a graveyard deck, it's not going to hurt you at all. Only hurts your opponents. So cards that only hurt your opponents are always going to be fantastic. But the really important wording here is opponent's graveyard from anywhere. Not it goes into the graveyard from the battlefield. They can't mill themselves, right? So I guess if you're playing a dredge deck, man, in Modern, this just completely hoses you, right? Because all the stuff you're dredging just gets exiled. Any self-milled deck in Commander is going to hate this card because all that stuff gets exiled instead of getting milled into your graveyard. If your opponent casts an Entomb and wants to put some busted creature into their graveyard that they can reanimate, it gets exiled instead. They want to discard that anger into their graveyard so that all their creatures get haste. Sorry, it's going to get exiled. This ability is so powerful. People are really going to hate this card. Already, I would put this card in any black deck I think that I'm playing. But on top of that, you can tap, sacrifice Dothi, Voidwalker, choose an exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. 2 mana for this. It's so good. Again, already looking like a $40 card just because it's going to see tons of play in Commander and Modern and Legacy, right? When you get a card that's going to see play in all 3 of those formats, you know it's going to be expensive. Coming in at number 2, and this one might surprise some people, Liquid Metal Torque. 2 mana artifact. Tap to add 1 colorless mana. Tap, target non-land permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. I really like this card. I'm putting this card in so many decks. And again, this list is subjective a little bit, but also I'm making a list that I'm sort of gauging by what I think people are gonna play or maybe what they should be playing. This goes in so many decks, right? It's a 2 mana mana rock, just that alone. A lot of people will play Mind Stone and cards like that because it's a 2 mana mana rock, comes into play, and you can use it right away also. Thought Vessel is another one that people play a lot. Like I said, the format is trending more towards 2 mana mana rocks, and the 3 mana ones are sort of disappearing. But that second ability should not be undersold. Being able to turn anything into an artifact, non-land permanent, is really, really good. So this is going in all of my mono white decks, my mono red decks, and my mono green decks. All of them. Why? Because all of those colors destroy artifacts really, really easily. If I have a Return to Dust in my hand, I want to exile one of my opponent's artifacts or enchantments, and wouldn't you know it, they also have an Elesh Norn in play. So I'm going to turn that Elesh Norn into an artifact, so now I can exile that as well. This is so good, especially, again, like in a mono green deck, which doesn't deal with creatures very well, but deals with artifacts really well. Now I can turn my opponent's creatures into artifacts and then destroy them. In a mono red deck that doesn't deal with enchantments very well, but deals with artifacts really, really easily, now I'm going to cast a Vandal Blast, and you know what? I'm going to turn that Rhystic Study into an artifact, so that dies to the Vandal Blast as well. This card is so good. Definitely should be going in any mono white, green, and red deck because those colors deal with artifacts really, really well. From there, now maybe I'm putting this in a Boros deck as well for that same reason. You know, it adds colorless mana, so you got to be a little careful there. You know, I mean, I don't know how many decks this goes in. I myself am going to put this in at least 5 or 6 decks. And coming in at number 1 is Harmonic Prodigy. And again, maybe this is a surprise for some people. I don't know. I get a little bit of feedback on what are the buzzworthy cards, but I don't spend a lot of time on social media, so I don't know what people are talking about necessarily. This is sort of like a blind critique for me, right? Because I don't really hear what everyone else is talking about. For me, this is the card that everyone is going to be putting in a lot of decks. 1 in a red, human wizard. 1/3 with prowess. But none of that is really important. The really, really important part is if an ability of a shaman or another wizard you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. That's huge. I mean, right away, people are going to say, okay, well, this goes in wizard decks. And it does. It goes in a lot of wizard decks. A red wizard deck. A Nala, obviously, this is going to go in. You're going to get an extra triggered ability for all your wizards. Shamans, you know, maybe, maybe not. And when I first saw this card, I was like, okay, shaman, how many shaman decks are there out there? Let's forget about the tribal aspect here. And I don't know if people sort of get locked into the tribal aspect. Forget about that. Forget about tribal anything. Let's just look at commanders, okay? So what I did is I did a quick search, just commanders, and I didn't even look at the wizards. Ignore the wizards for a second, okay? Because we all know this is going to go in a bunch of wizard decks. And if your commander is a wizard, that is red, that has a triggered ability. This is an auto include. Let's just look at the shamans, okay? And this is why I put this card at number 1. Atla Palani, that's a shaman, and it has a really good triggered ability, right? Whenever an egg you control dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, right? I'm sure we've all seen it before. Now this triggers twice. This is an ability of a shaman you control that is triggering, right? I'm only looking at the commanders here. This card is an auto include for so many commanders. We're looking for triggered abilities of shamans. For everyone out there looking for which decks this fits in, whenever, when, and at, right? That's a triggered ability. Those are the keywords you're looking for. Bralin, Sky Shark Rider. Whenever you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Bralin, Sky Shark Rider, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So that's a shaman. It's going to be triggering twice. We get to put 2 counters on our Bralin, and it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Really, really good in that deck. Gared, Conclave Exile. He's a shaman, and guess what? He's got 2 triggered abilities. When he enters the battlefield, you're going to get 2 Rhino tokens, and whenever he attacks, you get to populate twice. Absolute auto include in that deck. And these are really popular commanders I'm talking about, right? This is why I have this card at number 1. Judith, the Scourge Diva. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith deals 1 damage to any target. That's going to trigger twice. She's a shaman. Auto include in that deck. Jury, Master of the Review. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Jury. That's going to trigger twice, so you get 2 counters, and when Jury dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. That's a triggered ability, so that is also going to trigger twice. Absolute auto include in that deck. Karvak the Merciless. For anyone out there who still has a Karvak deck, used to be a real terror in the format. I don't see much anymore. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, Karvak the Merciless deals damage equal to a spell's mana value to any target. That's going to trigger twice. That is a shaman that has a triggered ability. How about Valduk? Anyone out there got a Valduk Keeper of the Flame deck? That's a shaman at the beginning of combat on your turn. That's a triggered ability. For each aura and equipment attached to Valduk, create a 3/1 elemental creature token with trample and haste. You're going to do this twice now. And hey, here's a newer card, Zafei Thunder Conductor or Thunder Collector, however you want to say it. That's a shaman actually, not a wizard, which is kind of surprising. I mean, I guess if it was a wizard, it wouldn't matter anyway. But whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you do all that stuff. That is a triggered ability, and it's gonna trigger twice. Harmonic Prodigy is an absolute auto include in so many decks. If you have a commander that is a shaman or a wizard and has a triggered ability. Absolute auto include, and that's why I have it at number 1. So that is my top 20 cards from Modern Horizons 2 for Commander, and I did a little breakdown again, just like I did with Strixhaven, just to see how each color did. Green only had 1. I only had 1 green card on this list, and it was the number 20 card. Blue had 3, not bad. White had 4, and red had 4, so pretty good. There were 5 artifacts, so 5 colorless cards that can go in any deck, which is good. It's always good to see in these lists lots of colorless cards so that everyone is able to play them. Black had 7. Man, black. And there was a bunch of cards, and some of these were the honorable mentions as well. And there was even some more cards that I probably could have gave a mention to. Black killed it in this set. There's so many fantastic black cards. So black really made out like a bandit in this set. And overall, great set. Really great set for Commander. The commanders themselves, the legendary creatures, actually weren't fantastic. You know, there was Garth One Eye, which people sort of were buzzing about. Of course, people always go to the infinite combo right away. I did my Commander Quick Brew and I had about 15 comments on that video. Deadeye Navigator and a Haste Enabler and you can go infinite. I mean, okay, I guess. There's like 80 commanders that you just win the game with 1 card, so I don't know why you want to jump through all those hoops. If that's your thing, right? If you want to just combo off and win or whatever, just veto and exquisite blood, you win. It's definitely an interesting commander. Really, there wasn't much else. Chatterfang and Garth One Eye are really the only commanders in the set that are going to see a lot of play, but that's okay. That is totally okay. You know, like I said recently, there's been over 300 new commanders in the last couple years, so it's fine. It's perfectly okay. I'm not upset at all that there's not a lot of really good legendary creatures in this set. I'm actually more excited about all the 99 cards, right? Having a lot of really good 99 cards, I think, is more important in the non-commander sets. So overall, really impressed with this set. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.